Tonight's presentation is titled Unbelievable Compressions. And our presenter is Mike Busch. Mike is president of Savvy Aviation Incorporated. He's an author for numerous aviation publications. He's a certified flight instructor, A&P mechanic with IA, 2008 Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year for the FAA, and a member of EAA. Mike, thanks so much for being with us tonight. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, good evening, everybody. I am finally recovered from AirVenture. It was actually a great AirVenture. The weather pretty much cooperated, and I did 11 presentations and had some really interesting get-togethers with a lot of wonderful aviators. So, and then I came home and soaked my head in a bucket for a couple of days, and now I'm back to normal. So tonight's presentation is on a subject that's very near and dear to my heart, and that is compression tests. You know, if you're an aircraft owner, every year you put your airplane in for an annual inspection, and then there's this moment of terror when your IA pulls your top spark plugs and takes a compression reading on each of the cylinders. Hopefully he does it immediately after you deliver the airplane when everything's still warm. And you hold your breath and wait for the numbers to come back, and if the numbers look good, then everything's fine, and if the numbers look bad, then you brace yourself for a bunch of work and a big invoice. You brace yourself not only for the fact that you're going to have a cylinder removed and either reworked or replaced, but anytime you have a cylinder removed, that kind of opens Pandora's box, because it puts a big hole in the side of your engine, and your IA is going to stick his head in there and look around. And if he doesn't like what he sees, then things could get really, really expensive. So this is kind of an ordeal or a ritual that aircraft owners go through every year, and we sort of want to change it. I mean, the typical dialogue is the mechanic says, well, we did the compression test and 2 of your cylinders were below 60 over 80 this year, so we're going to have to replace them. And since we're dropping the induction and exhaust and pulling all these baffles off and everything, while it's all apart, you might want to just go ahead and let us replace all 4 of the cylinders, or all 6 of the cylinders, however many you have. And a lot of owners wind up essentially getting talked into a top overhaul on the basis that, if a couple of cylinders are weak, then the rest of them are probably not far behind, and it's just a lot more cost efficient to change them all at once. At any rate, this is a major ouch to the pocketbook, and it also is frequently something that it shouldn't be done. Just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, anytime you replace a cylinder, nowadays new cylinders typically go for about $2,000 or $3,000, depending on what kind of engine it is, what the displacement is, and so on. If you can send your cylinder out for repair, then the cost is maybe half that much. But anytime you send your cylinder out for repair, there's always a risk that it will be deemed unrepairable. Just earlier today talked with a Seneca owner who had replaced quite a large number of cylinders on his twin, and every time he sent a cylinder into the cylinder shop, they called him up and said, "Oh, this thing has unrepairable cracks. We're not going to be able to repair it." I suggested maybe he might want to pick a different cylinder shop, but at any rate, there's no guarantee that the cylinders can be repaired, and a lot of cylinder shops are kind of zero tolerance outfits. And then of course there's the cost of the labor to remove and replace the cylinder, and depending on what airplane it is, how good the access is, and whether it's turbocharged or not, how complicated the exhaust is to remove, and how many cylinders on which side of the engine are being removed. You can figure somewhere between 4 and 8 man hours per cylinder. So depending on your shop rate and so on, you could be talking $300 to $1,000 in labor per cylinder, on top of the cost of either repairing or replacing the cylinder. So each cylinder could wind up costing somewhere between $1,000 and $4,000 a piece. And if you wind up going for the argument that you really ought to replace them all, which happens an awful lot in my experience, you could be, for a 4-cylinder engine, be out 10 grand, or for a 6-cylinder engine, more like $15,000. So this is a lot of money. So first of all, let's talk about whether this cylinder replacement is really required, because you know, in my experience, mechanics do a compression check and tell the owner, you know, we've got some weak cylinders, we have to replace them. So let's talk about whether we really have to. First of all, let's start with where the requirement is for doing the compression test to begin with, because by the time we're done today, I'm going to try to convince you that the compression numbers that your mechanic takes aren't worth the paper that he writes them on. But Appendix D of Part 43, Part 43 is the part of the FARs that deals with maintenance, and Appendix D, which is called Scope and Detail of Items to be Included in an Annual and 100-hour Inspections. So it's kind of the regulatory minimum checklist of what is required to be done at every annual, and if you have to do 100 hours, every 100 hours. Well, and the relevant part of Appendix D says, each person performing an annual or 100-hour inspection shall inspect, where applicable, internal engine for cylinder compression and for metal particles or foreign matter on screens and sump drain plugs. This reg was written a long time ago. Most of us have oil filters now rather than screens, but they didn't update the reg, but we all know what they mean. So you're supposed to check if the engine's making metal, which is perfectly reasonable, and the reg actually says that you're required to check cylinder compression. So that's where the regulatory requirement is for doing the compression test. So the mechanic really is obligated, if he's doing an annual inspection, to do a compression test. Now the next question is, so what's he supposed to do with the results? Well, Appendix D goes on to say, if there is weak cylinder compression, then he's supposed to further inspect for improper internal condition and improper internal tolerances. Now that's all it says. So how weak is weak? Well, the reg doesn't say how weak is weak. It just says weak compression. So that kind of leaves the question of whether compression is too weak to be acceptable in the eye of the beholder. So where did this 60/80 threshold that everybody seems to have bought into come from? That compression less than 60/80 is not acceptable. Well, that actually came from the FAA too, but not in a regulation. It's in an advisory circular. It's in a big giant advisory circular, AC 4313-1B, acceptable methods, techniques, and practices for aircraft inspection, repair, and alterations. This is a advisory circular the size of a pretty good sized telephone directory. and it's sort of the mechanic's Bible. And AC, so it is an advisory circular, and it's not a regulation. So it provides things that the FAA considers acceptable, but not the only way of doing things. But anyway, let's look at what AC 4313(1)B says, because it has some interesting stuff in it. But it says in pertinent part here, if a cylinder has less than a 60/80 reading on a differential test gauges on a hot engine, keep that in mind, on a hot engine, and procedures in paragraphs 814B5 I and J, well, I'll show you what those are in a minute, fail to raise the compression reading, presumably above 60/80, then the cylinder must be removed and inspected. So this is where the notion that if a cylinder measures less than 60/80, it must be removed comes from. Now, first of all, let's look at what those two paragraphs that it references are, that are things you're supposed to do to raise the compression. The first one, which was little subparagraph I, says that if you don't like, if you get a compression below 60/80, you're supposed to run the engine for at least 3 minutes and recheck the compression. And that's because compression readings are always better when the cylinder is hot than when it's not. And unfortunately, in the real world, even though AC 43 says that it's 60/80 on a hot engine, unfortunately, in the real world, we don't often do these compression tests as hot as we should. And frequently the airplane comes in and it's a matter of hours or maybe even days before the technician gets around to uncowling it and doing the compression test. So we often see compression tests being done cold. But even if the mechanic uses his best efforts to do a hot compression check, I mean, I fly a piston twin with 2 6-cylinder Continental engines, and normally I take the airplane up, fly it around the pattern a couple times, get everything nice and hot, stick it in my hanger just as quick as I can, pop the top cowls off as quick as I can, and start taking out top spark plugs and doing compression tests. But I've got 12 cylinders on 2 different engines. And, by the time I get to the last cylinder, it's not very hot anymore, no matter how fast I work. So it's hard to do that. So this says, if you get a compression that's problematic, you're supposed to run the engine and heat up the cylinder and then recheck the compression. And if you do that, in my experience, the compression is going to come up 10 points or more, sometimes a lot more. The second thing it says you're supposed to do is, and this would really be applicable if the leakage is past the valves, usually the exhaust valve, is to try to stake the valve by pressurizing the cylinder and taking off the rocker cover and using a mallet and a fiber drift to joggle the exhaust valve while it's under pressure and try to get it to seat better. Sometimes this has a dramatic effect on raising compression, sometimes it doesn't. But anyway, so the advisory circular says you're supposed to do the compression hot. If you don't get if you get a reading under 60/80, you're supposed to run the engine and try it again. And if it's a leakage past the exhaust valve, you're supposed to take off the rocker cover and try to stake the valves, or joggle the valve with a mallet and a fiber drift to try to get that compression to come up over 60/80. But if you do all those things and it's still under 60/80, the advisory circular says you have to remove the cylinder. However, if you fly behind a Lycoming engine or a Continental engine, this advisory circular doesn't even apply to you. Why? Because the advisory circular right in its cover page says this advisory circular contains methods, techniques, and practices acceptable to the administrator only when there are no manufacturer repair or maintenance instructions. So AC 4313-1B is a set of default procedures that are only to be used in cases where the manufacturer doesn't give you a procedure. But if the manufacturer gives you a procedure, then the manufacturer's procedure always takes precedence. And it turns out that both Continental and Lycoming do provide guidance on compression tests. So the guidance from AC 4313-1B that we just went through, which is kind of interesting, doesn't really apply to Continentals and Lycomings. You know, maybe it applies to Jabberoos or something, but it doesn't apply to Lycomings or Continentals because they provide manufacturer's guidance, and that takes precedence over the FAA's advisory circular. So let's see what that guidance is. Well, Continental's guidance, which used to appear in a service bulletin, SB03-3, and now appears in Continental's manual M0, which is their standard practices manual. I'll sort of summarize what it says, but it first of all says, well, the 60/80 no-go threshold does not apply to Continental engines. The no-go threshold, they don't actually give you a number, but they say that you have to calibrate the gauge with a master orifice tool. And that master orifice tool represents the maximum acceptable leak. So you take your gauges and you hook them to the master orifice tool, and you take what's essentially a compression measurement on that. And whatever number you get, that's the no-go threshold. Nowadays, most compression testers have the master orifice built right into the gauge, so you just turn a valve and the gauge measures the master orifice, and then you turn the valve the other way and it measures the cylinder. But at any rate, the threshold is based on a master orifice, and for almost all compression test gauge sets, that number winds up being somewhere in the low 40s. I've seen it as low as 40, I've seen it as high as 45, but somewhere in the low 40s is normally where that no-go threshold comes up. So Continental says that compressions can be as low as somewhere in the low 40s before you reach the no-go threshold. But M0 also says anytime you do a compression test, you have to also do a borescope inspection of the cylinder. And if the compression is below this no-go threshold of somewhere in the 40s, and you do a borescope inspection of the cylinder and you don't see any obvious reason for the low compression, like a burned exhaust valve or scored cylinder walls or something, then you're supposed to go fly the airplane and retest it. And unlike the advisory circular, which says run the engine for 3 minutes, Continental says fly the airplane for at least 45 minutes. It doesn't actually give a maximum, but it says fly for at least 45 minutes and then retest the cylinder that flunked hot. And when we do this, we always see a dramatic increase in the compression numbers. Like I said, almost always at least 10 points. And the most notable case of this that I've run into happened several years ago with a Cirrus client of ours who put his SR22 in a shop in Florida for an annual inspection. And one of the cylinders tested 38/80, which was below the master orifice threshold. And the shop said, we have to pull the cylinder. And we said, well, not so fast. Let's follow the guidance from Continental. So we had them dust off their borescope and take a bunch of borescope images. And we all agreed we couldn't see anything wrong with that cylinder, but it was measuring 38/80. So we said, okay, well, Continental says, go fly the airplane for at least 45 minutes and retest it hot. And the IA says, well, how are we going to do that? You know, I'm not allowed to fly the airplane unless I sign off the annual, and I'm not going to sign off the annual with a compression of 38/80. And we said, oh, yes, you are. And he said, well, on what basis could I possibly sign off an annual with a compression of 38/80? And I said, on the basis of what it says in manual M0, which is that that the fact that it has low compression doesn't mean that it's unairworthy. If it looks okay under the borescope, you have to give it the benefit of the doubt. So we convinced him to sign off the annual with an IOU that the customer would come back within an hour, and he was going to be standing there ready with his spark plug wrench and his spark plug socket and his compressor and his test set, and he was going to test that cylinder hot when it came in. So the customer went out and flew the airplane for an hour, brought it back. He quickly uncowled it and tested that cylinder, and the 38/80 cylinder measured 72/80 on the retest. Doesn't usually go up quite that much, but it just gives you an idea of why this is really, really, really good guidance, that we don't want to be pulling cylinders that look good under the borescope just because they have low compression. Here's a compression tester, and the yellow arrow is pointing at this little valve that is marked master orifice. Most of the compression testers we use nowadays have the master orifice built in, and we're supposed to calibrate the gauge every time we do a compression test right before, and we're supposed to write the master orifice reading in the logbook entry right next to the compression readings, because otherwise the compression readings really have no particular meaning, because the master orifice is what defines what the minimum acceptable threshold is. So at any rate, that's what Continental has to say, and I really like Continental's guidance, and we always try to hold the shops we work with to follow that guidance to the letter, because it's very enlightened, I think. Lycoming's guidance is quite different, and it appears in Lycoming Service Instruction 1191A. And Lycoming still adheres to the old 60/80 standard. But what they say in the service instruction is, if the pressure reading is below 60 psi, meaning 60/80, removal and overhaul of the cylinders should be considered. That's interesting wording. Doesn't say it's required the way AC 4313 did. It said should be considered. And this gives your IA a lot of wiggle room. If you have a Lycoming with low compression, he doesn't have to remove the cylinder. Now, not a lot of IAs have the courage to take that wiggle room, but it's important to understand that Lycoming does not require cylinder removal if the compression is less than 60/80. All they require is that it be considered. So let's talk a little bit about this compression test and why I'm not exactly a huge fan of compression testing. I wrote an article in the July 2023 issue just a couple months ago called "Unbelievable Compression" on this subject, and it was triggered by an email that I got from the owner of a Piper PA-12 cruiser or super cruiser, which is actually I guess it was the successor to the J5 Cub, kind of a cute, cool airplanes, powered by a Lycoming 0235. And this owner who emailed me had owned this airplane for quite a long time, and he had it maintained at the same shop by the same mechanic for quite a long time. And he meticulously recorded all of the compression readings that were taken on this engine over this period. It was a 13-year history that he sent me of compression readings on this 0235 engine for a four-cylinder, small four-cylinder Lycoming engine. And he explained to me that these compression readings were all done in the same shop by the same mechanic, and that during this 13-year period, no cylinder work had been performed on the airplane. No cylinders had been removed or reworked or anything. And if you look at these numbers, they're kind of all over the map. And it's a little hard to see in a table here, so I graphed them out. So this is the compression history, 13-year compression history of this Lycoming 0235 in the Piper Super Cruiser. That's right. Actually, the 13th year, the very right-hand numbers were done in a different shop, but the first 12 were all done by the same mechanic in the same shop. So there shouldn't have been any variation in terms of mechanic technique and that sort of thing. But you can see that there are no clear trends here. I mean, somehow or other owners get this idea that they expect to see incremental clear trends in compression, and they start out good, and then over time as the cylinders wear, that they gradually get worse and worse. That's not what happens. And this 12 or 13-year history here makes it pretty clear that that's not what happens. The most interesting cylinder of these 4 cylinders was cylinder number 1. So I graphed that out separately, and this is the compression history of cylinder number 1. So it went from 75, the next year it's down to 64, then it popped back up to 78, which is almost perfect. Then the next year it went down to 53. I asked him, well, how come the cylinder wasn't removed when it measured 53? And he said, well, I don't remember. But apparently his IA was one of those rare birds who did use his wiggle room to not pull the cylinder, or maybe he retested it and didn't record it or something. I don't know. But then it went up to 70, and then went it down to 60, and then it went up to 78. It's just all over the place. You know, and it seems very unlikely that the cylinder would get, you know, profoundly ill and then cure itself, and then get sick again and then cure itself. That just doesn't seem like a plausible explanation here. And to demonstrate that this is not exactly an outlier, there was a 600-hour endurance test that Continental performed down in its factory in Mobile on a TSI 0520 UB engine. Trying to remember, I think that may be the Bonanza, the 836 TC engine or something like that. But at any rate, to certify an engine, the FAA requires 600-hour endurance tests where they run the heck out of the engine in a test stand. And they run it essentially continuously for 600 hours, and they shut it down every 50 hours, change the oil, inspect the filter, do a compression check, fire the engine back up, run another 50 hours. And they keep doing this until they have 600 hours on the engine. It's a torture test that they do in their test cell. So they do check the compression every time they shut down the engine for an oil change. And during this test, this is the trajectory of the cylinder number 2 differential compression readings. Again, this was done by Continental in their engineering test cell. And again, you can see that the compression is all over the place. It starts out about 71, and it works its way down to 56, and then it pops back up, and it, after 450 hours, it's up to 73, and then it starts going down again. And again, it's not plausible to think that this cylinder, got ill and then got well all on its own. That can't possibly be the explanation. So what's going on with these compression readings? They certainly don't have the kind of trajectory that most people expect that they would have. And it just turns out that this is a terrible test. there's more noise than signal. The test is not reliable, meaning the results are not repeatable. You know, perfect example is this cylinder that tested 38 over 80 and an hour later tested 72 over 80. And it's not valid. The compression, the number doesn't correlate well with the actual health of the cylinder. It's just a terrible test. And it's been with us, you know, like pretty much forever. And it's been with us since back in the days where we didn't have anything better because we didn't have borescopes and stuff like we do now. But it's a horrible test. And there are just all sorts of artifacts that affect the test. Let me just discuss one of those with you. There are a whole bunch of things about the test that cause it to be not reliable and not valid, but here's one of them. When an engine is actually running and its cylinders and pistons and everything are up to normal operating temperature, the piston has a very tight fit in the cylinder. And the compression rings don't have to make up much of a gap. The piston fits very snugly in the cylinder, and there's very little opportunity for gas to leak past the rings. But we can't do a compression test on a cylinder that's at operating temperature. By the time we get to do a compression test, the cylinder is a whole lot cooler than normal operating temperature. Sometimes it's warm, sometimes it's cold, but it's never really hot. There's no way to test the cylinder anywhere near, you know, a cylinder head temperature of 380 or 400 degrees, which is what it is when the engine is actually running. So because the piston is aluminum and the cylinder barrel is steel, and aluminum has twice the expansion coefficient of steel, the piston is made so that it is considerably smaller in diameter than the cylinder barrel at room temperature. But as everything heats up, the piston expands, as I say, twice as fast as the steel barrel expands, to where it has a nice snug fit at normal operating temperatures. So we're not testing it at normal operating temperatures. We're testing much cooler, and so the piston has a really sloppy fit in the cylinder when we're doing the compression test, and the compression rings have to make up the difference. And the compression rings have a gap in them. And the piston, when we bring it up to top dead center when we're doing a compression test, doesn't come up to top dead center nice and straight. It comes up crooked because the connecting rod is pushing it sideways as we are rotating the propeller to bring the piston up to top dead center. So we got a piston that has a sloppy fit in the cylinder, and it's crooked. It's not centered in the cylinder bore. And we've got compression rings that are trying to make up the gap. And depending on exactly where the piston winds up, and depending on exactly where the gap happens to be, which is pretty much random because the compression rings migrate around when the engine is running. So it's unpredictable exactly where that gap is going to be when we do the compression test. But you know, depending on how this all comes out, we either have a tiny little gap like is on the right side that very little air can pass through, or we have a big giant gap like the one on the left side where a whole lot of air can go through. This is not exactly drawn to scale, but I exaggerated a little bit so you can see what I'm talking about. But so that you can have just dramatic differences in the compression reading in terms of how much air is getting past the rings, depending on, like I say, where the piston winds up and where the gap winds up relative to the piston. There was an old Continental Service Bulletin which didn't survive the transition to M0, but it suggested that when you do a compression test, if you don't like the number that comes up, try rotating the propeller to top dead center in the opposite direction, which will put the opposite side load on the piston, and see if you get a better number. And whichever number is better, that's the one you should use, which is actually not a bad suggestion, but I've very seldom seen mechanics actually do it. And it's kind of dropped out of the literature that this was an old service bulletin that was the predecessor, I think, of SBO 3-3. Now you can also see from this why it's so important to do compression tests as hot as possible. You're never going to have a piston that fits really snugly in the cylinder when you do the compression test, like it is when the engine's running. But the snugger the fit, the more likely it is that you're not going to have this artifact of the test that I'm illustrating in this picture. So we really need to try to do these tests as hot as we possibly can. But as hot as we possibly can is still not terribly hot. And the first cylinder we test is always going to be hotter than the last cylinder we test. It's just a fact of life. And the temperature profoundly affects the results, as does this random position of the ring gap and the piston. I was kidding my colleague Paul New the other day. I said, if you ever take your compression tester apart, you'll find a little tiny pair of dice in there, which isn't actually true, but there's a huge amount of randomness to these compression readings. And you could see that on the two graphs that I showed you, that compressions go high, compressions go low, and it doesn't represent any difference in the cylinder condition. It just represents the random elements of this very terrible test. So we really shouldn't be relying on compression tests as the be all and end all of cylinder health. But we have to do them. We're forced to do them. They're written into the regs. The regs are, very old and not likely to change. So we're required to do the test, but we're not really required to pay that much attention to them, to the test results. We really should be using the borescope, which is an infinitely better way of assessing cylinder health. And that should really be the driving force behind our decisions in terms of whether we need to do anything about a cylinder, and if so, what we should do. I did an EAA webinar a while back called Borescope Ascendancy, where I went into a lot of detail about what we look for with a borescope. I'm not going to go through that whole thing with you now, although you can look up that other webinar if you want to, but just show you a couple of quick pictures. One of the things we always look at really carefully with a borescope is the exhaust valve. And what we would like to see is an exhaust valve that has a symmetrical appearance like this one. This exhaust valve is in a state of really excellent health, and it appears very symmetrical, and it basically has an appearance that looks like a bullseye. They don't always look quite that profound a bullseye. This one is pretty profound because it's got a fair amount of exhaust deposits on the face of the valve. This was an engine that was probably operated rich at peak. If it's a lean at peak operation, the valve tends to be a lot cleaner and the signature tends to be a lot more subtle. But the important part is that it's symmetrical, which means that the heat load on the valve is even all the way around, and there isn't any place around the circumference of the valve where exhaust is leaking out during the combustion event. So we're looking for symmetry. What we are hoping not to see is something like this, which is a highly asymmetrical valve, which is actually, this one is right on the verge of failure, and it has an extreme hot spot right where the little yellow arrow is. And this particular valve probably wouldn't have survived more than another 10 hours before a piece of it broke off and shut the cylinder down. And by the way, that used to happen quite a bit, that we would actually lose exhaust valves. It was called swallowing an exhaust valve. And in the early years of my aircraft ownership, that was something that happened pretty regularly. Now that we have borescopes and we can look at this stuff and see it coming 50 or 100 hours ahead of time, there's really no excuse for us to ever swallow an exhaust valve again. But the earlier we can detect these problems, the easier it is to remediate. The other thing we look at with exhaust valves is we try to take a look at them with the valve wide open and work the borescope around. We didn't used to be able to do this with the old borescopes, but now the borescopes are so good that we can get really good pictures and get a good look at the sealing surfaces, the back side of the valve and the seat, where the sealing is actually done. And what we're looking for is a well-defined, even, fairly shiny surface there, free of excessive deposits and so on, that shows that the valve and the seat are sealing well together. This valve looks very, very good in that regard. Here's one that looks not quite so good. And again, you can get a really good view of the sealing surface. I love these pictures because we didn't used to be able to get pictures like this, but now with modern borescopes, we can get beautiful, beautiful, very detailed, very high resolution close-ups. And you can see that the sealing surface on the valve is not shiny. And there's deposit formation on it, and there's a lot of deposits on the sealing surface of the seat. And you can just look at this valve and see that that this cylinder probably didn't have a really good compression reading, because if that valve and that seat can't seal well, which they can if they're in this condition, you're going to have a fair amount of air leaking past the valve when you do the compression test. Now, by the way, this engine would run perfectly fine. You'd never notice the slightest bit of degradation in this cylinder. It would make full horsepower and everything. But the problem is that if it's not sealing well, then it will eventually start to deteriorate more and more until it gets to the point where it has a profound hot spot like that other valve I showed you, and we don't want to let it get that far. So you can see that this valve and this seat, this problem could be fixed very, very quickly. All we need to do is put a little valve lapping compound on there and clean up those surfaces, get those deposits off, get nice shiny contact surface reestablished. And we don't have to pull the cylinder to solve a problem like this if we catch it, early like this, where there isn't a lot of metal erosion or warping or anything like that. And that's what we want to do. We want to borescope these cylinders fairly frequently so that we can catch these things early and do something about them and not have to pull cylinders. While we're borescoping, we also take a close look at the cylinder barrel. Here's an example of a cylinder. The bottom of it is the top of the piston, and the top of it you can see the cylinder walls. And this is a fairly high time cylinder, but you can still see at least a little bit of the original crosshatch on it. We don't see really any vertical scoring on the cylinder wall that would indicate a ring problem. We don't see any corrosion pitting. So it's a high time cylinder, but it looks in pretty good shape, and it's probably got a lot of useful life left. Here's a cylinder barrel that has got problems. You can see very profound corrosion pitting. You can see vertical scoring on it. This cylinder barrel has been let go. Most likely this engine was in a condition of disuse for a long time, and the oil film stripped off, and we got this rusting going on. So this this cylinder probably is going to have to go. But you can see just, you know, what a wonderful tool the borescope is for looking at the cylinder and determining its condition, determining exactly what's wrong, making good decisions as to exactly what needs to be done. Does the cylinder need to be pulled, or is there something we can do to solve the problem without pulling a cylinder? We always like to avoid pulling a cylinder if we possibly can, because it's expensive and it opens Pandora's box and all the stuff we were talking about before. So, you know, as I said, if air is leaking, and by the way, when you do a compression test, which unfortunately we have to do, the numbers that you get on the gauge are less important than where the air is leaking out. So when you do a compression test, you're not just supposed to look at the gauge and write the number down. You're supposed to use your ear and say, where's this air leaking? Do I hear it coming out the exhaust pipe? Is it leaking past the exhaust valve? Do I hear it coming out of the oil filler? Is it leaking past the rings? Theoretically, I suppose it could be leaking past the intake valve, and you'd hear it coming out the induction air filter. Although it's very unusual for low compression to be caused by intake valve problems. But you're supposed to listen and figure out where the air is leaking. So if the compression is low because air is leaking past the rings, you know, we know why that happens. It's mostly because the piston was cool and it had a very sloppy fit, and we got unlucky about where the ring gaps came up. And so doing an engine run and then retesting that cylinder just as hot as we possibly can get it will almost always bring the reading up by at least 10 points. And sometimes, as I said, it can bring it up really dramatically. If the air is leaking past the exhaust valve and the borescope reveals that the valve isn't too far gone, and we just looked at a couple of, you know, at a valve that wasn't too far gone, and earlier we looked at a valve that was really far gone and right on the verge of failing. And if it's too far gone, then we're going to have to pull the cylinder and get it revalved, unfortunately. But if it's not too far gone, if we catch it in time, and the way we catch it in time is to borescope regularly, then we typically can resolve the exhaust valve problem without removing the cylinder. And you know, we've developed this technique for lapping valves in place. Mechanics have been actually doing this for a long time. And the traditional procedure for doing it is you don't remove the cylinder, but you drop the exhaust off and then work through the exhaust port to get the lapping compound in on the valve. But I developed a procedure that doesn't even require dropping the exhaust, where the only things you have to remove are the top and bottom spark plugs. And so it's very fast and very easy. And you basically put a borescope through the top spark plug hole, and you work through the bottom spark plug hole with these applicators. I buy these things in packs of 100 from Amazon for $10 or something, and use a heat gun to warm up the stem and bend it at an appropriate angle, and then I can use it to working through the bottom spark plug hole to apply valve grinding compound to the sealing surfaces of the exhaust valve. The valve, the rockers and valve springs have been removed, and so I can twirl the valve and work the compound all around the valve. And I use a cordless electric drill coupled to the valve stem with a piece of tubing. This actually shows clear plastic tubing, but I found that the clear plastics tubing is a little too fragile, so now I use a little piece of automotive brake line to couple the drill to the valve, and we spin the valve with the drill and pull on it to put pressure between the valve and the seat with grinding compound in there. You spin it for a little while and you hear it go from a very gritty sound to a very smooth sound. And then you lather, rinse, repeat several times. And then you switch from coarse grinding compound to fine grinding compound. You do a little bit more. And then you clean everything off and put it all back together. We usually replace the rotocoil just because they're cheap and it's easy to replace it while everything's apart like this. That's the rotator cap that rotates the valve. And then after 15 or 25 hours, we'll stick a borescope back in there and see if the valve seems to be healing itself up, which if you do this right, and the valve wasn't too far gone, it almost always does. I made a video of how to do this called lapping exhaust valve in place without dropping the exhaust. It's on our YouTube channel. Here's a short URL if you want to watch the video, especially for you A&Ps out there. bit.ly/lapping-in-place, easy to remember. But at any rate, it's a neat procedure. We've now used it a lot. We've used it with tremendous success. And again, if you borescope the cylinder relatively often, you can catch these problems early enough that lapping will resolve them, and we don't have to pull a cylinder and send it out somewhere and have the valves and seat replaced and all of that stuff, and run the risk of having the cylinder condemned, or run the risk of looking in the engine and seeing something we don't want to see. We just don't like pulling cylinders we don't have to. And this is a very, very non-invasive way to solve exhaust valve problems if they aren't too far gone. So at any rate, just a couple of key takeaways, and I'll open it up for Q&A. Never, ever, ever approve cylinder removal based solely on a compression test. The compression test results. The compression test has been responsible for, condemning tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of cylinders over the year that didn't need to be removed because the test is so bad and so unreliable and such a poor measure of actual cylinder condition. It's early 20th century technology. We have so much better ways of dealing with things now, and particularly with really phenomenally good borescopes available for $250. I mean, I encourage every aircraft owner to own his own borescope, and to, if he does his own spark plug stuff, stick a borescope in there and look around. I used to say never remove a cylinder based solely on compression unless it's 0/80. I've stopped saying that because even if it's 0/80, it turns out that one of the reasons it could be 0/80 is because of, particularly in a Lycoming engine, because of a sticking exhaust valve that doesn't close all the way. Well, we don't have to remove cylinders to fix sticking exhaust valves. Lycoming has a really nice service bulletin for how to do that, where you basically drop the valve into the cylinder, remount the guide to eliminate the sticking, and pull the exhaust valve back into place. It doesn't require cylinder removal. So even if the compression is 0/80, we don't want to be pulling a cylinder. We want to be sticking a borescope in and saying, what's wrong here? And a lot of shops that now do use borescopes will only borescope cylinders if they have low compression. That's not a good idea. We should always borescope every cylinder anytime a top spark plug is removed. It takes no time, and if it gives us a chance to catch an exhaust valve problem early, then we can fix it by lapping, and we don't have to pull a cylinder. If we don't find out about it until it's too far gone, then it may be too late. We may have to pull the cylinder and revalve it. So we want to be borescoping these cylinders as often as we possibly can. So we always have to require a thorough borescope inspection, which means borescoping every cylinder at every annual, and preferably any time you do spark plug rotation or any reason that the spark plug is removed. It almost seems to me like malpractice not to stick a borescope in the hole, while it's vacant. And always consider alternatives to cylinder removal. We have these minimally invasive remedies now. If it's an exhaust valve problem, we do lapping in place. If it's a ring problem, we have a ring wash procedure that may clear it up. Or if it doesn't clear it up, at least it will identify exactly what cylinders have the problem. So always consider minimally invasive remedies as an alternative to cylinder removal. We really don't like to pull cylinders unless there's really no alternative. So I'll get off my soapbox now, Tim, and open it up for some Q&A.
Thanks, Mike. Great presentation. Starting off with Red's question. Why is, or what is the history behind using 80 for the standard testing? Why not test at 60 or at 100?
I really have no idea, except that probably back when this test was invented, that was all that the air compressors were able to put out. I don't know where 80 came from, but it's when the cylinder is actually in operation, the peak combustion pressure in the cylinder is typically more like 800 psi. If it's a turbocharged airplane, it could be 1,000 psi. So it's funny because even if there's like a bunch of deposits on the seat and on the face of the valve that are allowing air to leak when we're doing a compression test, when there's 800 or 1,000 psi pressing against that valve trying to close it, those deposits typically don't make any difference. But they make a difference when we're doing a compression test at 80 psi, which is just another one of these many artifacts of the test. The test it's testing the cylinder under extremely unrealistic conditions that have really very little bearing or very little correlation to what the engine actually does when it's running.
John wonders, how is a compression test affected by density altitude?
I don't know, but the any effect the density altitude would have on the test is so much smaller than all of these other noisy things that happen in the test. I mean, you can be pretty sure that 600-hour endurance test that Continental did was all done at pretty constant density altitude because the engine basically ran continuously until the 600 hours was up. And the compression just varied wildly by 20 points up and down. So if density altitude could affect the reading by 1 or 2 psi, it wouldn't make any difference.
Joseph wonders, is compression testing required to be a leak down test, or would testing similar to the way automobile testing is done be acceptable, i.e. rotating the engine with the starter?
Well, that's a really interesting question. The regulation says nothing about how you do the test. It doesn't say anything about 60 over 80. It doesn't say anything about differential compression. It just says if it has weak compression. That's all it says in the reg. The advisory circular makes it pretty clear that it's a differential compression test, but the advisory circular doesn't really apply to most of our engines. Both Continental and Lycoming specify using using a differential test, but you could argue as to whether doing it the way Continental and Lycoming says is the only acceptable way of doing it. The Lycoming guidance is in the service bulletin, and generally Part 91 operators are not required to comply with service bulletins. Continental moved moved their guidance from a service bulletin to manual M0, presumably to give it a little bit more in the way of teeth. There certainly wouldn't be anything to stop you from doing an automotive type, shall we call it a dynamic compression test, in addition to the differential test. Whether you can just not do the differential test at all, that's kind of a borderline question. Like I said, the reg doesn't say anything about how to test compression, but the advisory circular, Lycoming's service bulletin, and Continental's M0 guidance all are pretty clear that they want you to do a differential compression test.
Randall says, I don't disagree with any of this, but it still seems the compression test has some value since it would detect problems with the rings, given that a borescope can't really see those. Your thoughts?
Well, I sort of disagree. I understand where you're coming from, but first of all, the leakage past the rings that is detected by the compression test, it tends to be more artifact than it is real because of this problem about the rings being very distended out of this piston that has got a real sloppy fit and all that stuff. But the other thing is that any major problems with the rings, like a broken ring or something, we see in the borescope. That's why we look for vertical scoring. If we see vertical scoring on the cylinder walls, and it's not unusual to see a tiny bit of vertical scoring, but just from like dirt or something that got in there. But if we see any significant vertical scoring, and particularly if we see vertical scoring that looks kind of fresh, that's a pretty good indication that we have a broken ring or a problem like that. So I'm not sure that I agree that the borescope can't detect problems with the rings. It can certainly detect severe problems with the rings. And I'm also not sure I agree that the compression test does a very good job of detecting the condition of the rings because of all these artifacts that we're talking about. And look, I'm not saying don't do compression tests because we have to follow the regs, so we're going to do the compression test. I'm more talking about what we do with the results of the compression test as opposed to whether we actually do the test or not. We need to take those numbers with a huge grain of salt. We need to use it maybe as one little data point in our assessment of cylinder condition, but not the dominant data point, the way most mechanics do. They kind of treat compression as kind of the be all or end all. And so not just mechanics. I mean, I've seen, I can't tell you how many aircraft buyers I've seen walk away from buying an airplane because of the compression test readings that were done during a pre-buy, which to me is insane. I mean, first of all, why would you walk away from a perfectly good airplane just because it had, a weak cylinder? But second of all, just because the compression is low doesn't mean there's anything wrong with this cylinder. Maybe it means, well, we need to look further, but I just think we put way too much weight on these compression numbers that really turn out not to correlate very well with anything.
Several people are asking if you could give a recommendation for a good, inexpensive, owner-purchased borescope.
Yeah, absolutely. The borescope that I have been using for the last several years is something called a Vividia, VIVIDIA, Able Scope model 400L. I was at their booth at AirVenture, and it looked to me like the 400L has now been superseded by something called the 450, which was only very slightly different. But the 400, VA 400 or VA 400 or VA 450, if you get the current model, they changed the camera on it about a year ago to dramatically improve the resolution. And so you want to make sure you get one of the new crop of VA 400s, or if you get a VA 450, I'm sure those will all be the newest ones. But the quality of the images got drastically improved, and for some reason they decided not to change the model number when they improved the camera. So if you ordered it off of Amazon, you never knew whether you were going to get one of the old ones or one of the new ones. If you order it directly from the manufacturer is a company called Oasis Scientific, and they make lots of borescopes, real fancy ones, but this VA 400L or VA 450 is a basic rigid borescope that just works very, very well for cylinder inspection. And the price, it actually used to be $200. They raised the price to $250. I still think it's a screaming bargain. It is a USB scope. It doesn't come with an imaging device, so you can plug it into a small laptop computer. You can plug it into an Android tablet. I actually use a little Wi-Fi box that they also offer, and I can image it on my iPhone or on my iPads and stuff. And it, you can capture stills, you can capture videos, and if you go look at that video of lapping in place that I did, all of that stuff was taken with a VA 400L borescope. But it's an exceptionally good scope for what I think is an awfully reasonable price.
James wonders, my readings have always been very high for the past 10 years in the 75/80 range or higher. To what would you attribute this?
I would attribute it, well, you're gonna make me guess now because you're not gonna tell me anything, but I'll make a couple of guesses. First of all, I'm gonna guess that you fly behind a Lycoming engine. And second of all, I'm gonna guess that your compression tests are done with the engine hot. I think that's as far as I'll go with my guesswork. How'd I do?
All right, John says, it seems the concern is always about the exhaust valve. What about the intake valve?
Intake valves almost never give us any problems. I mean, if you think about it, the intake valve runs nice and cool. The only time it's exposed to heat is when it's closed, and when it's closed, it's heat sinked very well. So the intake valve never gets particularly hot. In fact, intake valves are not even made of the exotic kinds of high temperature nickel rich alloys that exhaust valves are made out of. They're made of much more pedestrian stainless steel because they just never get hot. They live an easy life. But I've always said, if I ever come back in reincarnation as an engine part, the one engine part I don't want to be is an exhaust valve. Because those things, I mean, it is absolutely astonishing that they last as long as they do. They live a horribly, they're exposed to these ridiculously high temperatures. They go in and out of their guides with essentially no lubrication because that you can't really get any oil in there because it would immediately coke up. It's just too hot. It's just that's a horrible thing. Don't come back as an exhaust valve. Do me a
We
favor.
all have a new thought, Mike Busch incarnating in the afterlife as an engine part.
Yes, please, Lord, don't make me come back as an exhaust valve.
Hey, so speaking of that, Chris asks for
I'd like to be an
exhaust.
accessory gear, something nice and calm, you know.
Yeah, that has a long life, right?
Yeah, don't make me reciprocate.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
willing to turn.
Spinning is fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Chris says for exhaust valves on the verge of failure, non-symmetric, non-bullseye pattern, is this due to the valve not rotating?
Sometimes
Mhm.
it sometimes it's due to the valve not rotating, so that the you know the part of the valve is in a hotter part of the combustion chamber, and part of it's in a colder part. And one of the reasons for it rotating is to equalize that heat load all around the circumference of the valve. But it also can be caused by by the valve either having metal erosion significantly or starting to warp significantly. So we've seen exhaust, seriously burned exhaust valves that were still rotating, and we've seen a lot of seriously burned exhaust valves that stopped rotating, where the fact that they stopped rotating probably contributed to their burning.
Several people have asked the question, once you do the lapping or the on your exhaust valve, the lapping procedure, so you got that lapping compound in there. How do you clean all that up in the
Oh
end?
yeah, everybody always asks that. Uh, I rigged up a little homebrew nozzle made of a piece of plastic tubing that I melted the end closed, and then poked a little hole in the side of it so that I could shoot solvent at a 90-degree angle, and I insert it through the bottom spark plug hole. But that's really not the most important thing I want to say about it. The most important thing I want to say about it is, contrary to popular belief, it is not really important to clean that stuff out. We'll clean it out as well as we can, but it's not important to clean it out super thoroughly. And again, that's a misconception that a lot of mechanics have, that if you put lapping compound in there, you got to scrupulously clean everything, which you sort of can do if you drop the exhaust, but it's pretty hard to do if you don't. The point is that the valve grinding compound is it's basically grease with some silicon carbide particles suspended in it. And if there's valve grinding compound left on that exhaust valve, the minute you start the engine, the grease instantly liquefies, and the stuff just immediately gets blown out the exhaust. It's not going to hang around the cylinder, and it's not going to cause any mischief. And there's no way that it can really move into the cylinder, because the exhaust flow is going the other way. So my view, it's you don't really have to be too OCD about trying to clean the stuff off. It'll take care of itself once you start the engine.
Mark just made a comment. He agrees with what you're saying. He used to be in medicine, and in medicine, it is malpractice not to do minimally invasive procedure.
Yeah, I typically go talk to the Flying Physicians Association every year, and I love doing that. And I'm the only aviation speaker that sits through all of the medical education lectures, because I find this stuff fascinating. But the parallels, in my view, between medicine and aviation maintenance are very, very striking. But aviation maintenance is, many decades behind medicine in terms of lots of things. But you know, for example, in medicine, we have subspecialties that are diagnosticians. We have radiologists, we have pathologists and stuff. We should have a diagnostician rating on the mechanic certificate, but we don't have anything like that. And most A&Ps are pretty good surgeons, but they're often not the greatest diagnosticians. And but yeah, this whole notion of using the least invasive procedure possible is something that just has seemed to have been lost on the GA maintenance community. That mechanics, I mean, they just love taking stuff apart, and we try to get them not to take stuff apart if it's not absolutely necessary.
Mm-hmm. Stevens asks, are compression tests required for an experimental aircraft? Yes, right. We got to do our annual condition and inspection right in accordance with Part 43, Appendix D. That's right in our operating limitation that's issued to all experimental aircraft.
Well, thank you for answering that question for me, Tim, because I was hoping you would do that. I don't claim to be an authority on experimental aircraft.
It is interesting. Experimentals have to follow that same checklist of items as the minimally acceptable, you know, for an annual.
Yeah, the ones that I find most mysterious. I've talked about this before, or SLSAs, because the LSA rule of Part 43 basically says this part 43.1, which is the applicability, says this is applicable only to aircraft with standard airworthiness certificates. And then the SLSA rule, which is 91.327, I believe, says that SLSAs must follow the applicable portions of Part 43, but it doesn't say which ones are applicable. It just leaves that as an exercise to the reader. But so yeah, but anyway, it sounds like yes, you have to do a compression test, but no, you don't have to remove a cylinder if the compression is any particular number. The reg just says, I mean, Part 43 Appendix D just says weak compression without defining it any further. So that gives us a lot of wiggle room as to what we do with those numbers once we get them, but we do have to collect them.
Yeah. John wonders, is engine performance affected with reduced compression numbers?
It's not, and that's very interesting. Continental did a test back, I'm sure it was 30 years ago, because I remember sitting down over dinner with the vice president of engineering of Continental, and he told me about this. But they took one of their engines, I think it was an IO 550, and they ran it up on the dynamometer at their engineering test cell in Mobile, and it was a 300 horsepower engine, and it put out like 305 horsepower on the dynamometer. And then they went and they filed the ring gaps on the compression rings to intentionally make the compression worse. And they brought it down to 60/80, and they ran it up on a dyno, and it put out 305 horsepower. And they filed the ring gaps some more, got it down to 50/80, and they ran it up on the dyno. It was 305 horsepower. And they brought it down to 40/80, it was still 305 horsepower. Now, they didn't go any further because by the time it was down to 40/80, the crankcase was so pressurized by blow-by, and the oil was getting blown out the breather so fast that they couldn't run the engine for very long. But they never did get any decrease in horsepower. I heard another story, which I can't personally vouch for. I can vouch for the one I just told you. And so the story I'm about to tell you, I think is true, but it could be apocryphal. And that was, there were some University of North Dakota aviation students who just for the hell of it put together a small 4-cylinder Lycoming and left the compression rings out altogether to see if the engine would run. and they got it to make like 80% horsepower with no compression rings and stuff. And again, the point is, at operating temperature, the piston has a very snug fit in the cylinder, and the compression rings don't have to do a lot. At the temperatures we do the compression test at, the piston has a very sloppy fit in the cylinder, and the compression rings have to make up a pretty large annulus. So that's why it's so much difference between what we see in a compression test and what actually happens when the engine is running.
Kartik wonders, thanks for the informational session, Mike. And is it true that Continental engines generally have lower compression than Lycomings? If so, why is that?
Yes, and I don't know. but yes, Continentals generally have, at least in my experience, tend to have lower compressions. And Continental seems to recognize that in terms of what their no-go threshold is.
Daniel says he bought the Vividia VA400 borescope and his A&P, and him used it on the Continental 0470 and his Cessna 182. A&P liked everything he saw, except that he felt one exhaust valve did not open as far as he thought it should. The mating surfaces look good. Is there a possibility that the cam lobe is worn?
Yeah, there's a possibility. There's also a possibility that a less expensive possibility that the lifter might have leaked down. If the lifter has a higher leak down rate, then by the time you did the compression test, it may have leaked down, and so it wasn't lifting the exhaust valve as far as it should. If you're really interested in that, you can take some measurements. Continental, I don't believe, publishes specs for how much valve lift the engine should have. I don't know why they don't publish that. But if you went around and intentionally made sure all the lifters were completely leaked down and completely compressed, and then you measured the valve lift, say with a dial indicator or something, this is all something you can do without taking very much apart. See if that particular one is an outlier and is lifting less than the others. But it could be a cam lobe that's starting to get flat, or it could be a lifter that leaked down. The lifter is, I mean, it's super easy to replace on an 0470. Don't have to split the case or anything. You just pull it out from the outside. The cam, of course, would be kind of bad news. But I wouldn't be too concerned about this, in the sense that a flat cam lobe is not something that is going to make you fall out of the sky, and it's going to, in theory, would cause a small amount of performance degradation, but in my experience, pilots almost never notice it because it's so small. So, you know, if you're not seeing ferrous metal in the filter, then I certainly wouldn't start taking things apart just to find out if you had a flat cam lobe. I mean, you actually can, with a 0470, just pull the lifter out and stick a borescope in the vacant lifter bore and get a look at the cam lobe. You can even put a pick in there and rub it on the surface and see if there's, anything that looks like a crack or anything like that. You can actually see quite a bit without pulling cylinders and so on. And Continentals can on Lycomings, but on Continentals you can. On Lycomings, if it's a 6-cylinder Lycoming, you can stick a borescope down the oil filler and get a pretty good look at a couple of the cam lobes. If it's a 4-cylinder Lycoming, there's no good place to stick the borescope. I kind of wish they designed these engines with little plugs that you could take out and stick borescopes in, but when they designed these engines, they didn't have borescopes, so that wasn't part of the design.
Well, Mike, we've got the end of our time period here. Thank you so much for this awesome session. Looks like we had about 660 people logged in tonight with us. Take a moment and share closing thoughts.
Okay, well, my first closing thought is I hope that means we have 660 people who won't be spring-loaded to pull cylinders at the next annual. Any rate, if you guys are not already on my email list for our monthly newsletter and interesting maintenance stories that we sometimes send out to our mailing list, and you'd like to get on the list, the easiest way is to text the word Savvy, SavvyPrebuy, to 33777, and the little bot will ask you for your name and your email address and add you to the list. I think that only works in North America. If you happen to be seeing this from Europe or South America or something, then the best way to do it is to go to the SavvyAviation.com website and click on the button that says put me on the newsletter list. My 4 books are available where fine aviation books are sold. EAA bookstore online. The Aircraft Spruce sells them. You can order them off Amazon. The first 2 books are available in audiobook form. And now that I'm back from AirVenture, we're about to start working on the audiobook version of the 2 ownership books. Big project. They were 500 pages a piece, but I'm determined to try to get those in audiobook form by the end of the year. I'm kind of an audiobook junkie. I do a podcast with my colleagues, Colleen Sterling and Paul New, and we just today actually did our first recording session where we're switching from once a month to twice a month. The response to the show has been so great, and the number of questions that have been coming in have given us such a backlog that our producer Ian Twombly decided that it was time to make it a twice a month podcast. So I guess it'll be coming out on the 1st and 15th of the month going forward. We did a live version of the podcast at AirVenture, and that's going to be put out. And these things are done both as a podcast and a video cast, so you can watch them on YouTube and see our smiling faces, or you can just listen to them like a normal podcast. But if you'd like to participate in the show, if you have a question that you'd like us to deal with, just email it to Ian at podcasts@aopa.org, and he'll schedule you for one of the recording sessions, and we'll all have a lot of fun with your question. And finally, the next 3 of these first Wednesday of the month webinars. I know this is the second Wednesday of the month, but Tim cut me a little slack because the first Wednesday of the month was the day I got back from AirVenture. But the September webinar is on legal interpretations. If you have a question about what a regulation means, or you think maybe a regulation has got a mistake in it or something, you could send a letter to the rulemaking lawyers at the FAA Office of Chief Counsel, and if you're lucky, you'll get back a letter of interpretation, which basically is a binding interpretation of the reg. And so I talk about some interesting ones, legal interpretations, particularly ones that indicate that the reg doesn't mean what we all used to think it meant. There's some interesting interpretations. October is entitled A Fortunate Catch. I'm going to basically be talking about the importance of maintenance aware aircraft owners as the last line of defense against maintenance induced failures, and an interesting story about that and some really good pictures that I have to share with you. And in November, the webinar is entitled Miracle in Sioux Falls. I don't want to give away the punchline on this, but I'll just tell you it had something to do with my flight to AirVenture this year. And I also have some really good pictures. So those are the next 3 webinars, and I think that's about all I have for tonight, Tim.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, Mike. Absolutely fascinating, absolutely awesome information. Several people saying thank you and a great webinar. And to everybody who tuned in, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Have a great night.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.